Hello, this is Dr. LA. Today we're going to be focusing on grants. This lecture is going to be mostly looking at understanding grants, like the types of grants that there are, as well as what to look for in a grant in order to determine whether it's suitable for your organization or the, project or, program that you are seeking funding for. I'll briefly talk about locating grants, but then there's also a independent learning activity for you to do that will go through, how to actually find grants. So there's various types of grants. These can be government grants, and they could be like the federal government. So there's national grants. For example, New Horizons is a grant that the federal government has done over the years for programs and services to help seniors. Then there's provincial grants. So, obviously, like in Newfoundland, we have the government provides different grants. For example, the community wellness grant. And there can also be local grants. For example, in St. John's, the city of St. John's has grants for people to apply for as well. Obviously, though, the competition of government grants varies. So local grants are probably not as competitive, whereas federal grants are very difficult to get because it's they're looking at things nationally. Also, the amount of money differs. Like federal grants tend to be, they could be like $20,000, whereas provincial might be 5 or 10, and local could even just be $500 or a couple of thousand. Then there's foundations. So foundations are basically it's kind of a giving organization that's usually affiliated with either a company or it could be a family. For example, a family that has some, financial, assets, and they might, create a foundation in memory of someone's name that was in their family that they lost. Or it could be, for example, there's the McConnell Family Foundation. They can also be community foundations. So those are usually established with a particular, geographic area. There can also be special purpose foundations. For example, there's the Hospital for Sick Children Foundation in Toronto, or for example, the Janeway has a foundation. Now, usually those are to give to those foundations, not the other way. Then there's also things like service club foundations. For example, the Lions Club, the Shriners, the Rotary Club. These are all foundations then that you can apply to. And they usually all have, a specific focus that they're looking for. There's also commercial giving. So, these are your for-profit, your private organizations that are wanting to give money, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But these grants really go directly to the charitable organizations from the corporation. And, for example, there's the TD has a corporate giving foundation, RBC, all these are different ones that you can apply to. And then finally, there's also other, which is like there could be an academic or a professional association that gives. For example, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have Recreation Recreation Newfoundland and Labrador, and they have grants that they provide to members in order, for example, to purchase adapted equipment or to hold a specific event. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about some of the foundations. You can probably understand about government grants. So a private foundation is any not-for-profit organization that's established by an endowment. An endowment means that the people have put money into the bank, a sufficient amount, and that money is then being invested or it's getting interest put on it every year, and the money then is used. The interest then is used to provide not for profits for for grant giving. So the private foundation may carry out its own charitable activities, or it may give funds to other qualified donees, like usually registered charities. But it can also be like a not-for-profit organization. And usually each of these foundations has a different type of focus on, what they're looking at. Some private foundations maybe are focused on children and youth. Another one might be they're focused on seniors. Another one might be about healthy eating. Another one might be environment. So you can look then to see which ones fit better with your organization. A public foundation is usually things that are affiliated then with still government, okay? So it's public, like a hospital foundation. And it generally gives more than 50% of its income annually to other types of donees that are usually then registered charities. It has to be established either as a corporation or a trust, and more than 50% of the directors and trustees deal with each other at arm's length, though. These public foundations generally receive its funding from a variety of sources, and it also may carry out some of its own charitable activities. Then there's corporate giving programs. So this is more commercial or in the private sector. So these are grant-making programs that are established and administered within the profit-making company, for profit. And gifts or grants go directly to a charitable organization or not for profit. And again, they also usually have a focus. So, for example, RBC over the years their foundation has really focused on physical activity and physical literacy, and with their campaign called The Right to Play. For example, some years back, myself, Dr. Loeffler, Dr. Sullivan, and Dr. McGowan, there was a few other profs who subsequently have left HKR, but we all received a Right to Play grant from RBC. And this allowed us then to purchase equipment and create a better play program, our physical literacy program on Saturdays. We were able to evaluate it better, create a website, hire staff, get it going again. And the intent was then to integrate it more into the community and also into our different teaching of our courses as well. So other types of organizations that give grants, as I already mentioned, an academic institution. So this is usually not for programs or services that are recreation or children's based or education based, but it's usually more for research purposes. For example, at MUN, you can get grants, especially if you're a new professor, in order to do your research. But there are some of them that also help with non-for-profits. For example, we have a Quick Start Fund. And we also have some that involve public engagement. So although you might not be a prof, maybe you're working for an organization in the community that would benefit from a collaboration with a professor in order to do a partnership that would involve, it does maybe perhaps help with research, but it also would have benefits to your organization. As I mentioned before, there's professional societies and associations. I mentioned RNL, but also things like the Arthritis Society. It's at the national level, and then there's obviously provincial arms, but they also provide grants for research and for projects. And then there's other not-for-profits can also provide funding. So anyone's allowed to provide funding as long as it's a not-for-profit organization. We also need then to understand within these, those are the types of organizations that are sponsors, that provide money. We also have to understand that there's different types of grants. And I'm going to go through each of these and explain what each of these different types of grants is for. The grants are vary depending on what they're actually going to fund. So not you have to be careful to make sure that the type of grant actually matches what your program or project is. So a challenge grant, or I would say it's actually more commonly called a matching grant nowadays, it's a grant that is paid if the donee organization is able to raise additional funds from other sources. So, for example, if I was a not-for-profit, I could apply for a challenge or a matching grant. And let's say the granting agency will give me $10,000 if I can raise an additional $10,000. And I would raise that maybe from, I could be doing some fundraising. Maybe it is, there could be another organization that is helping to give the money as well. And these are actually becoming increasingly more popular. And that's because they're wanting not-for-profits and organizations to, also try to get some of the money themselves for the project. It also is beneficial to encourage partnerships and collaboration. So, these are becoming increasingly more common, I would say, in the world, probably due to financial constraints. A demonstration grant is when you're demonstrating something. It's made to establish an innovative project or program that will serve as a model. And if it's successful, it might be replicated by other organizations. So, for example, when I ran the Community Garden Alliance in St. John's, which is a nonprofit that was establishing community gardens in the area, one of our grants that we got was from Seeds of Diversity. Seeds of Diversity is itself a not-for-profit that's focused in Atlantic Canada, and it's trying to have people use local plants in order to improve the environment and also to attract pollinators and that sort of thing. Anyway, so we received a grant of, I believe it was $10,000 in order to create a demonstration pollinator garden in Rabbit Town. So the point of it was then to highlight what we had done in order to then serve as a model that can be replicated elsewhere in the province. So a demonstration grant has to be innovative. So it's got to be something new, something exciting, and it usually has to be something that, you have done some pilot testing on. Like, it can't just be something totally new that you've never done before. And anyway, and the point of these is usually, it could be a foundation that it wants you to replicate it in other geographic areas where perhaps, they have their companies, or they want you to replicate this, for example, as a demonstration site for other provinces in Canada then to be able to look at and learn from and replicate. There are general operating grants. So remember, operating money is what your operating budget is, what you actually need to run your organization, even if you didn't provide programs and services. So, for example, salaries for the executive director, or the heat and water and the rent or mortgage on the building. These are all things that you have to pay regardless of whether you're bringing in any form of income. So that's your operating money. So there are grants then that might be used from the organization to also be used as, to help pay for operating money for a single year or multi-year. And there is also what's called general grants, which are usually then developed they're called unrestricted, meaning it can be used for anything.
These types of grants were more popular, probably more like 20 years ago. I would say that it's not very often that you find general or operating grants anymore these days. And actually, quite often, most grants actually specifically state that you cannot use the money for operating expenses. So, for example, most grants say it has to be for a new program or to purchase equipment or, to help with staff. It can't be to help pay for the administrator's salary or for any utilities, etc. Then there's seed grants. These are more popular. They could also be called a pilot grant. And this is used to start a new project or organization. Now, it says, I do have here, they sometimes might cover salaries and operating expenses for the organization, but more often they don't. Usually, this is for a project. So it's seed money to help get you started, or, to purchase equipment for certain things. For example, you could get seed money maybe to purchase some sort of like computer or software expenses that you may have, or seed money to help get, let's say, your equipment, let's say for a physical activity program that you're running. You need a little bit of seed money just to get things started. And that's why it's called seed. Like, you're planting the seed and then you'll be able to, your project or organization will get going. Then there's project grants, and these are for one-time activities or activities that are defined within a timeline. They're usually for a single year. They can be for multi-years, but they usually don't exceed more than 5. And project grants are obviously specifically for a certain project. So it's like a one-time grant. These can be really great in order for organizations to get money to do a program or project. However, once that grant is finished, you no longer have any of the money to help with staffing, and that's actually, you'll find that most nonprofit organizations, most of the time, they're using their money to pay for staff, for people who are not normally, they're not full time, they're being paid under grants and contracts. Then there's capital grants. A capital grant is for buildings. It's for renovations and equipment. It might enhance community spaces, improve accessibility, increase energy efficiency, for example, or innovative technology. These are very uncommon. And it used to be that you could get these in order, to help with a, like fixing your roof or having a new building or that kind of thing. But nowadays, in today's economic climate, is very, very rare. But that's why I usually see I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's called a capital campaign. So these are usually done by foundations in order to help raise money to help improve a building. For example, in Toronto, the Sick Kids Hospital, it currently is going through a capital campaign where, the hospital is, the building is, I'm not sure how old it is, but it's over 50 years old, I think. And it's in severe need of equipment and, a new infrastructure, really. And so, that they're doing a capital campaign, but they're seeking then donations from, corporations or from individuals to get that money. Once in a while, you do see capital grants come by from, foundations or even the government. Right now, there is a movement for some capital grants right now in Canada, and that has to do with accessibility. And that's because there's, we have some new accessibility guidelines and bylaws now in terms of building infrastructure, making them inclusive for people with disabilities. So there is a little bit of money for that way.
Another term that you may hear of is request for proposal, or RFP. And it's when a funder will put out a call for proposals for a specific program. So they're saying, we have a request for proposals, let's say for projects or programs involving, let's say, children's physical literacy. And what they're doing is they're seeking, seeing what organizations or people are out there that may have interest in the program. And they're asking you to, in this funding program, and they're asking you to put a proposal together for what it, what it is that you might want to accomplish if you actually got the bid. Often requests for proposals are not so much about you actually getting funding for a program or project, but it's more about you providing a service to an organization itself. For example, there could be a call out that says, I'm just making this up, but the Ultramar company has a request for proposals for people who could put together and have a contract to do corporate wellness across in their organizations. So you would then put a bid together, and then they're looking at those to see which one of the different organizations that have put in a bid that they would actually like to hire. Usually, requests for proposals are very they're difficult to read a little bit. They can be daunting, but you're allowed to ask questions. There's usually a contact person on these that you can go and submit all of your questions to. Some of them have a specific date by which questions are due, so make sure you have to quickly make sure you're reading that. And there's lots of things then that you can clarify then to help make your bid better. Another word that you might see is letter of intent. So this is an LOI. This is especially used for grants that are national or might get a lot of people submitting to. They're usually for grants that are a lot of money too. And the purpose of this is they basically ask you to write a short summary of what you would like to do if you were actually going to write the full grant, a full proposal. So a letter of intent is usually just a summary, like just a couple pages. And then the organization reads these letters of intent and then asks you, selects so many of them in order and says, now, yes, that looks great. You can please submit a full proposal. The reason for this is that, one, it helps for the grant organization to clarify any questions that people may have, to make sure that they have people applying for the proposals for projects and programs that are in line with what they're looking for. And it also is nice for you as the grant seeker, because you can then just write a short piece instead of writing this full proposal that you may or may not even get. So, for example, that same group of profs that I was talking about earlier when we got the RBC grant for the play project, before we got that, we also applied to the Lawson Foundation. The Lawson Foundation is a family foundation in Canada, and they give out a lot of money. So we were first asked to write a letter of intent. So just briefly explaining our project. It was unsuccessful. We were not asked to write the full proposal. But that's okay, because at least, we tried, and then we didn't use up all of our time and energy and resources writing this great big proposal for something that we weren't going to be competitive for.
So the grant process is usually you have to establish your need. Why do you need this grant? Granting organizations want you to have a rationale for why you really need this and how you're going to do it. Then you need to research the different funding sources. You analyze the guidelines of the funding and select the best source. You might refine your concept and then you write and submit the proposal. And there's usually follow-up activities as well, including evaluation and a report. Grant organizations want to make sure that you were actually successful. They want to see outcomes. They want to see the benefits of your project or program. So you usually do reports. You might even go to a conference and provide a presentation. For example, after we got the RBC grant, I did a presentation for Recreation NL's annual conference, and that was, part of things we had to do. We had some students who go to some academic conferences and also present there, and we had to, write up a whole report that involved evaluation. So in HKR 2100, which is, Oregon admin, I'm having you research the funding sources, analyze the guidelines, and then select your best source. So you're developing a project, a hypothetical program or service that you're doing for an organization. Find some funding sources, figure out which one of those funding sources might be best, and you need to justify it. Then in HKR 3100, Advanced Oregon Admin, I have students actually write the proposal. So you'll have this as a two-step. So if you're doing 3100 next year, you can still use, you have the potential to use the assignment in 2100 in 3100. There are a lot of other terms that you need to understand. So they're full of different jargon. So one of the things that people ask about is in-kind contributions. So you often see this. And an in-kind contribution is can be equipment, supplies, or some other resource as distinguished from a monetary grant. So some organizations are looking to see what other types of supports you may have from other organizations or from people. So, for example, you may be a not-for-profit and you're in a building, you have an office in a building, and you're not required to pay rent for that building. That would be an in-kind contribution. Another example is on our play project. The gym in our physical education building is actually not owned by Memorial University or, Human Kinetics and Recreation. Technically, it is owned by the Works, which is in itself a not-for-profit. And the Works charges $75 an hour for organizations to use the gym, which is quite affordable, really. But remember, they're a not-for-profit, so they have different rates depending on what people are using it for. Well, the play project does not actually pay the Works the $75. So an in-kind contribution to the play program is that the Works provides the gym for 3 hours every Saturday. So 75 times 3 hours, over the whole year. So when we were then applying to grants, let's say the RBC Right to Play grant program, in our grant then we're saying, hey, we actually, they do have the cost of the gym, but it's an in-kind contribution being donated by the Works. And this type of thing looks good on grants because it shows that you have partnerships and you have other people who are also helping to alleviate some of the costs. Another example is I donate to a lot of organizations
my in-kind time for program evaluations. So I have done a lot of evaluations for grants, for a program or service for an organization. So when they write the grant, they write on it, and it says that Dr. LA is giving an in-kind contribution of X amount of money to do the program evaluation. And I just kind of figure out how many hours it would be and roughly what I would charge then. Let's say I might charge $50 an hour, and it's going to take it would take me maybe 10 hours to do this, and then put that into the budget for the grant. And so granting organizations like this because it shows them that the organization is doing whatever it can with a limited budget to make the project successful. And the organization also has partners that will also help to make it successful. Another example of in-kind contributions is, volunteers. Having our play project is primarily run by volunteers, except for we have, a faculty member who they themselves are volunteering their time though for that. And then we usually have had a coordinator, but all the rest of the people are students, whether HKR or education students. And, they are at least, they could be paid for that type of job, at the Y or Max Gyms or other types of organizations. But then we can put that in as an in-kind contribution or donation. Sometimes sponsors will request that you write a letter of inquiry. It's usually no more than 2 pages, describing your idea. Based on this information, they decide whether you should apply for the grant. So this is very similar to a letter of intent. If so, the sponsor will send you an application package which will include the guidelines of writing the proposal. Letters of inquiry are often more likely to be used in foundations, I should point out. So this is just simply saying, explain why they should be interested in your project, how it meets the mission or values of the grant, and why your project is important, who's going to benefit from it, the goals and the timelines and that sort of thing. And then hopefully they will, might ask you then to submit a full application. Another term that sometimes is seen on grants is cost sharing. So this is when sponsors are willing to fund a portion of the cost of the project, but they want you to come up with the money or the resources to do the rest of the project. This is similar to the matching one that I was speaking of earlier, a matching grant, but sometimes they call it cost sharing. And these other resources of how you're funding the project, they could be in kind, or it could be staff or volunteer time. It could be equipment that you already have. For example, for our play project, we were able to say that HKR donated all that equipment. Our dean purchases all of the equipment that we use in the gym. Now we use it for teaching purposes, but then we are also using it on Saturdays for the play program. Or it could be space, as I already mentioned, for like the Works giving us the gym. Cost sharing could also come from other sponsors. So it's more common nowadays, for example, to say, like when I was doing the Community Garden Alliance, I might have I remember one grant where we got $1,000 from one grant, from one organization to buy seeds and soil. Then I had a for-profit organization give a little bit more of the soil that was needed. And then we had volunteers, and then there was in-kind donations. And so you're showing them how there's a lot of different people and organizations helping you with the cost of this project. And then hopefully the grant will give, the granting organization will give you the rest of the money that you need. It's very important that you get to know a grant. So you'll be searching for a bunch of grants, and you're going to narrow it down to your top 3 for the program or service that you're developing for your project. And then you need to really look at all of the information about the grant. You need to go through it with a fine-tooth comb, figure out what are the strings that are attached, really. So this includes deadlines, amount, eligibility, activity location, and what can be funded. I'll go through each of these. First of all, deadlines. You always have to check the application deadline. Is it feasible for you to apply? It's best if you could have the grant done 2 weeks before it's actually due, so that you can, polish it up and that kind of thing. I've been doing it when just on the deadline, and it's terrible, trying to get your different letters of support from people and, all the materials that are needed. And also, it will, sometimes it just doesn't even make sense for your project. For example, I know in Newfoundland, there was a big problem with they were called SWASP grants, and they were basically money to help pay for staffing in the summer for not-for-profits. So these were usually high school and university students that were being hired. One of the problems, though, is that the application for the grant, as well as when you would know if you got the funding, was in June. And this usually meant that most students, like especially high school students, the good ones, already have a job in place. And also, you didn't know in time whether or not, you were actually going to get the funding. So it didn't have a very practical deadline. And also, sometimes, though, maybe a grant has, maybe the deadline is really quick and you're worried, like, I don't know if I could possibly make it. Well, the more that you write grants, the more you end up using, you cut and paste stuff. You're basically polishing. Once you write one grant, you're never writing it all over again new. You're still using a lot of the materials that you have done before. Some grants have continuous or undefined deadlines. And this is more common in foundations. If you look at foundation websites, they usually let you apply at any point, but they specify, let's say, 4 times a year that their board actually meets to look at the requests and, just determine who should be getting the funding then for that quarter year. You also need to look at the amount. What is the minimum and maximum amount that will be funded, that the grant's going to fund? Does it meet your needs? For example, you may have an expected budget for your program or service that's $10,000. Well, if the grant is only $5,000, you're only covering 50%. So you either need to apply to multiple grants and say that you're only seeking 50%, and hopefully you can get it all covered, or you need to apply to a grant that has a higher amount. The higher the amount, like the higher their maximum is, the more competitive the grant is. And and also, if a grant is, let's say their maximum amount is $20,000 and you only need $1,000, well, they're not going to give that to you. They're looking to find something that's a bigger project. So it's better than to seek a granting program that is closer to the amount that you need. And that's why it's a very good idea to develop a rough budget for your project or program before you look at grants. So you need some kind of idea of how, what's your budget going to be so that you can, be more strategic in knowing what type of grants you should be applying to. You also have to look at the eligibility. And now sometimes they don't have restrictions on this, but sometimes they do. So these are examples of possible eligible groups and projects. So you have to make sure that your application has eligible criteria and that you find the grant opportunity, that best meets your needs. For example, sometimes it says you have to be an academic institution or you have to be a public, government. Sometimes it says nonprofit. And that's why a lot of organizations actually register their organization as a nonprofit. It's actually quite easy to register as a nonprofit. You just go to the government, you fill out, I shouldn't say it's easy. There's some work going on, but it's it's not that difficult for a small group of people to develop into a not-for-profit organization. Whereas a charity, there's a lot more work because obviously that involves taxes. So a lot of people will register their organization as a nonprofit just so that you can apply for grants. For example, when Community Garden Alliance first got started, we were not a nonprofit. The Food First NL, formerly known as the Food Security Network, they were very kind and were sort of like a parent organization to us. So at first I was writing grants, but it was actually Food First NL that was technically the organization. And then they would give us, the money. And then after a year or so of that, we decided to make our organization an actual nonprofit so that, we could apply directly for grants ourselves. Sometimes it says you need to be a small business. Sometimes grants actually say an underrepresented groups, like being female or having a disability, being a person of color, indigenous. And again, sometimes the project is specific. Sometimes it might say like you can apply for capital expenses, so like infrastructure and buildings, or it might say that operational expenses are not allowed. You also need to look at the activity location. So this identifies any requirements about where the grants may be used. That means that the project must take place within a certain geographic area. Sometimes it's unrestricted. So it won't say anything about where your project has to take place. For example, but or it could be unspecified. But quite often they do have something. For example, when I was doing my PhD in the States, I had a hard time applying for research funding because I was not a resident of the United States and they didn't accept like student status. And so I couldn't apply. But I couldn't apply to the Canadian grants either because obviously in Canada, the grants said that the research had to take place in Canada. Obviously, federal grants, it needs to take place in Canada. If it's a provincial grant, obviously they want that project to be taking place in, let's say, Newfoundland or Labrador. And if it's a local grant, they want it to take place in their city or town. With foundations, you also might find this, and often they, especially if it's a corporate foundation, it often says that the project has to take place in an area where that company has like a factory or a business or headquarters, that kind of thing. So it might actually say, for example, Walmart has grants, and it specifically says that the grant has to take place in an area where there is a Walmart. Now, nowadays that can that could be everywhere. But like in Newfoundland, there's only so many Walmarts. So it'd be more restricted, for example, to a place like St. John's then. then we also have to look at what can be funded. So these are different things that you have to look at, and I'll go through each of these. So you want to look at, does it pay for travel, program development, personnel, so that's like staff, equipment, promotions, rental of facilities. You want to look at professional development, like does it pay for conferences or workshops, or operating costs, which I've already talked about, or indirect costs. And quite often grants won't pay for any of that. So these are things that you need to look at. And if you have in your budget, you've got, let's say you have travel. Maybe you have to be driving to different locations in order to do the project, or service that you want. Well, if they don't cover for travel expenses like gas and car usage, then maybe that grant's not for you. Or maybe you need to seek funding just for that component of your project from another source. Sometimes grants will specifically say that it won't cover equipment. Sometimes the grant will say that it won't cover staff, like nothing to do with any type of staff. Now, staff, this would be more like seasonal staff, might say that. It also might specifically say that it won't cover professional development or training, or it won't cover renting facilities. So you need to look at all the different things that it is saying. Now, pardon me. More typically, though, it is operating costs that we have to look at. So a grant might very specifically say that it will not cover heating, lighting, or general utilities. It might not cover support staff, such as administration or human resources or senior management. Usually, though, they will cover the program staff. For example, I'll use McMorran Community Center as an example. They have 3 or maybe 4 staff. There's the executive director, and then there's a program director, and there's another, kind of admin person, and that's it. Oh, and custodial services. The rest of the staff who are at McMorran are under grants. So they are being hired to do specific program or specific service, and their hourly rate, their paycheck is coming then from different granting organizations. So that's common. But often the grant will not cover like the salary for the executive director, or the salary for your full-time admin staff. Sometimes you'll see like it'll say that won't pay for staff recruitment or training costs. Or it might say it won't cover office equipment or IT services, computer stuff. It might even say it won't cover postage or communication. So these are just things that you have to look at to make sure that it will cover it. Now, if you're a project, you need some of these things covered, then your options are, well, either this grant is not good for you and you need to keep looking, or maybe you can get funding from another source to cover things. Like maybe you can apply to a smaller grant, another one, an additional one, a second one, to help with, let's say, staff recruitment and training, if that's one of the costs that you need covered. So there are basic components of a proposal. Now, you'll see that more and more nowadays there's a form, and because they're wanting it to be brief and succinct. So although I've applied to some grant proposals that, they might have been 20 pages long, but and of all the stuff that they wanted. But more and more nowadays, it's an application, and it's usually just like a paragraph for each section. But usually there's a summary or an abstract, then like an introduction, like describing your organization, Usually you need a problem statement, like a needs assessment of why, like, what's the rationale for this project. And having things like references, like citations, that always helps there. Then there'll be a section on goals and objectives, what your methods or design or your procedures are for how you're actually going to go about this, and the timelines. There's always a section for evaluation, and then budget and budget justification. And they usually ask for a whole bunch of appendices too. And this could be like an annual report of your organization. It could be examples of past projects you've done. You're usually allowed to put a lot of supportive materials in the appendix. I'll be going more over locating grants, but locating grants changes all the time. And you'll see the independent learning activity I have for you. I did that, developed that a few years ago. And already now all the links are different. And that's because over time, either some organizations dissolve and they don't have their things on it anymore. For example, I used to go to an organization all the time called Charity Village, and they were great, and they had like every funding source in all of Canada. But now, it's, I don't know if it's for profit organization, but you have to pay to subscribe. It looks like I would have to pay $50 a month to be able to use their database. So, it's not really that useful anymore. So usually you get on listservs. So for example, Recreation Newfoundland and Labrador, they have a listserv for their members. And not only do they have grants, but they also, on their website and in their email communications, announce the different grants that especially Newfoundland has. You also need to keep an eye on agency and government websites. So, for example, in Newfoundland, we have the Community Sectors Council of Newfoundland and Labrador, so that it specifically focuses on not-for-profits and posts a lot of resources that are up there. The federal government also has, website for funding that you can look at. The province does as well. Every province, I've given the Newfoundland one. As I said, there's often these multi-purpose type organizations. And then there's also more local ones, like in, for example, around St. John's, we might look at Eastern Health. So I'll be, next week, you'll be going through this activity. I'm updating it to be a little more practical. But basically, you'll find that, in any job that you have, you start to learn more and more about all those grants that there are. And there's grants also for in education as well. For different schools or different regions. And so, in whatever job you're in, you just start to learn about all the different grants that are available. People let you know, but it's also good to know of certain websites. So, hopefully, you've learned a little bit then more about understanding grants and what to look for then when you're evaluating them. It's not just about finding the grants, but then you've got to determine, is this a good grant for me? And that's what you'll be doing for your assignment, is going through and saying, like, is the amount enough? Does it cover the costs that I want to look at, etc. You'll also find on our course shell that I've provided you with a bunch of grant writing resources. I suggest that you just download those and have them for your future jobs. They help. You'll also find that there's a lot of you might find organizations help with grant writing workshops. For example, Recreation Newfoundland and Labrador sometimes has grant writing workshops. I've helped to give them. Jennifer Janes is often someone I've seen who's been doing them lately. Even like the university has this. So
there's a lot of resources for learning about grants, and it's something, in my experience, the best way to learn about grants is to actually write one. Just apply. And that's where you really learn a lot about, best practices and, what is going to be more likely to be funded, and also which grants are more appropriate for your organization.